Hi, my name is Mady, and I'm on a journey to lose weight and we up in here trying to have a baby. Now, I don't know how many of you guys know this, but I do have a traditional type of job. I work 40 hours a week. I have other obligations, but I also have YouTube. So once a month, I like to post a sit-down talking video because quite frankly, these are the easiest to edit, to kind of give myself a break, to give myself a rest. It keeps me going. And typically I will talk about fertility struggles or other things that are kind of rattling around the old brain. However, I genuinely like story times. I know they had their day in the sun in like 2014, but I still be rewatching people's story times because I really enjoy them. I like them. They're good. People are really good at telling good and concise stories, and that is not your girl. That is not me. Before I get into this probably very rambly story time, although I did write down some bullet points, I just want to put out there just a few things. Number one, nobody needs to be judging me. I feel like when people tell stories like this, other people like comment like, wow, you were so stupid to go through all that. I just want this to be clear. This is not an ongoing issue. This issue is donezo. It is over. I was in my early 20s. And something else very important of note is that these stories, because there are a bunch of micro stories leading up to something, these stories took place over the course of about 3 years. About 3 years they took place. And so it was kind of like trickling, whereas you guys are going to get in one big dose. It kind of trickled in throughout the years. Just to be clear, that is the gist. Now, this stalker. We're going to call this stalker Joe. It is worth noting that this stalker was a coworker. And the job that I worked, I did work in a city, but it was a very small city. In fact, it was half the size of the city I currently live in. And so jobs weren't scarce, but it was hard to find a good job with good benefits and good insurance and all that stuff. And this job ticked all those boxes. So if you hear these stories and you're like, Mady, what the hell? Why didn't you like go to someone? First of all, I did. I went probably later than I should have. Second of all, there was this feeling of like, I don't want to rock the boat because, you know, I really like my job. I want to keep my job. I don't want there to be a bunch of drama at my job. And so, yeah, okay. I feel like I'm alluding to a lot, but the last thing that you need to know, the last thing before I get into the story, Joe had a wife and Joe had a special needs son. Joe's wife worked at the same place that we worked at. She worked in a different department. She had pretty different hours, but she did work there, which is crazy. Now, there's a lot of Dora the Explorer-like clues of like, hey, this little nugget of information, we'll need this to solve the crime later. You feel me? No? Okay. All right. So let's get into it. Let's talk about this. So this job that I got, that I will not say where I worked, but basically this job was my first big girl job outside of college. Before that, I had worked at a bunch of random places, and I also worked at a lot of food places. This was a more established place. I felt like an adultier adult. And when I first started, Joe and I had very different work schedules. I worked night shift for the first year that I was there, and Joe was my opposite on day shift. So we were like two ships sort of passing in the night. We would see each other very briefly at shift change, but other than that, you know, we just didn't talk like that. I will say I do remember there was one day, I don't wear a lot of makeup. You guys, I'm sure, have noticed that. I don't know how to wear makeup. I never learned. The most makeup you'll see me wear, unless I'm going to some kind of special event and someone else put it on me, is lipstick. And so there was one night where Joe came in for his morning shift and I had some very bright red lipstick on, and Joe asked me if I knew what DSLs were. And I'm not going to say what they are, but I am the type of person that if somebody says something really uncomfortable to me and they're like smirking, and Joe, when he was asking this, was smirking, I will make them spell it out, and quite often they won't. And so sure enough, I was like, you mean like the internet? And Joe was like, no, that's not what I mean. And I'm like, well, why don't you tell me what you mean? Now, Joe kind of had a reputation amongst all of our coworkers for being a bit of a creep. Joe never went too far, but it was like little comments like that where people were like, ugh, Joe's a creep. Joe's a bit of a sleaze, whatever. So eventually I went on to day shift and I was working the same shift as Joe. Not all of my shifts were with Joe, but a few of them were with Joe. And I don't know if any of my, especially my female commenters, can relate to this, but I'm a pretty nerdy person. I don't know how well you guys can see my shirt, but this is like a Lord of the Rings reference shirt. I don't know if you guys have noticed like all my games and stuff like that. I play video games. I have Legend of Zelda tattoos. Joe was one of those guys who it blew his mind that a girl could like video games and nerdy things. We're out there, we're everywhere, but he was one of those guys that just didn't believe it. He thought that video games were a masculine thing, and so he thought it was crazy cool that I was into them. I don't know how to say this, but probably the first really truly weird eye-raising thing with Joe was that Joe started getting me little gifts. Now, I cannot emphasize enough that these were little gifts. One of them was a keychain for my birthday. It was actually a Legend of Zelda keychain because the tattoos. And the other was like a nice pair of Legend of Zelda socks. Again, very small gifts. And I never really would have raised an eyebrow about this, but my coworkers who had worked with Joe for much longer, because Joe had been working there like 10 plus years, they did. They were like, oh wow, Joe never like brings anything to potlucks. Joe is a very stingy person. Joe never brings anything. He never donates anything whenever like, you know, they're having various drives and things like that. He always says charity starts at home. It's real weird that Joe's giving you gifts. But I never raised too much of an eyebrow because Joe like kind of didn't make it a big deal. He's like, hey, happy birthday, here's a keychain. Hey, I had this extra pair of socks and they don't really fit my feet right, so here you go, even though they were new and in a package. Okay, regardless. It just didn't seem like a big deal. I was dating someone at the time, and that person was not Henry. This was, like I said, years ago. Also worth noting, Henry would have never tolerated some of the stuff that I'm going to tell you guys. Regardless, I was dating someone and my following birthday was coming up and Joe was like, hey, I really want to get you like a shirt. What size do you wear? And I'm like, you really don't have to do that, Joe. Like, I don't ever get you anything for your birthday. Like, please don't worry about doing that. And then at one point he's like, oh, you know those like compendium like guides? Like they have a Legend of Zelda one. Would you want that? And I'm like, Joe, those are like 40 or 50 bucks. Please don't do that. He would keep bringing it up, and this was at the point where I was like, oh, I'm a little uncomfortable, but he just wouldn't take my no for an answer. And so finally I mentioned, well, I'm actually dating someone and they're a little uncomfortable with you getting me gifts. This wasn't entirely true. I mean, they kind of were. I think they would have been uncomfortable with the bigger gifts, but like, again, keychain, socks, who cares? I don't know why, but Joe found that to be amazing. Like, he would constantly make jokes like, oh, is your boyfriend going to come up here and fight me? And I'm like, no, he's an adult. He wouldn't do that. That's stupid. Oh, yeah, well, making Matey's boyfriend jealous over here. And I'm just like, nobody's jealous, Joe. Everything is fine. Again, none of this stuff is like unforgivable or what the hell. It's just, you know, it's just a little weird. It's just a little weird. I would say the first really weird, bizarre thing came whenever I moved with my boyfriend at the time into his mom's house. Now, this place, we're going to call this place Smallville. Why not? Smallville was a small town located about 45 minutes outside of the city that we all lived and worked in. And so in casual conversation one day, I mentioned to Joe, I'm like, yeah, you know, we're moving and all this stuff. And Joe's like, oh, where are you moving to? I'm like, Smallville. And Joe was like, that's crazy. I grew up in Smallville. What neighborhood are y'all moving to? And to this day, I regret saying it, but I did. I said the neighborhood. And Joe was like, that's the neighborhood I grew up in. Oh my God. Who is your boyfriend's family? And so I tell him, and he did know of my boyfriend's family. It was a small neighborhood, small town in the South. None of this is crazy, but Joe really fixated on the fact that I was moving to Smallville. And in fact, there was one time where Joe made a comment like, man, I can't, what are the odds of you moving to Smallville? Can you imagine if you had moved there and I hadn't met my wife and you hadn't met your boyfriend? And then he just kind of let that statement like hang in the air. And at this point I was 23. And so I was like, well, Joe, considering the time that you lived in Smallville and the time that I'm living in Smallville, even if I lived there when you lived there, I would have been like 15 and you would have been like 30, because Joe was a good like 13 or 14 years older than me. I don't mind an age gap, but like not when it's illegal. So regardless, Joe made a really big deal about Smallville. So much so that one day we were all hanging out in the office. It was a slow day and we were kind of chit-chatting and I was distracted talking to someone else, and Joe was at his computer and he was like, "Hey, matey, didn't you say that your boyfriend's mom had a pool?" And I was like, "Yeah, she has a pool." He's like, "Does she have like one of those cool slides?" And I'm like, "Yeah, but it doesn't really work though." And he's like, "What about a diving board?" And I'm like, "Yeah, but it also doesn't really work though." And Joe turns his computer monitor toward me and is like, "Is this the place?" And he has up on Google Earth her house. Yeah. And I'm like, "Why would you look that up? That's a little weird. It's giving creepy." And he's like, "Well, I basically knew what house she was in. I couldn't place it." And basically my shock kind of gave away, like, yes, of course, that is the house, you creep. Some people may be horrified already at this point in the story, but it's like worth mentioning. It's like, oh, it's just Creepy Joe being Creepy Joe. Who cares? But to this day, I do regret confirming. I wish I had been like, "No, it's a different house. You're mistaken." I regret it. I think he would have found it anyway, knowing the neighborhood I lived in, and he knew what car I drove, but still, I regret it. But alas, I did not know. Something I don't believe I've mentioned on the channel is that I was married once upon a time. Now, I have mentioned that I had a fiance that passed away in my very early 20s. However, I was married before Henry. And obviously it didn't go well. I don't mean to laugh. I laugh when I'm uncomfortable. I'm getting married. Joe already has a wife and child. And for some reason, Joe was hell-bent on coming to the wedding. Now, the venue that I had gotten married at was a very small venue. And so I told Joe, I'm like, "I'm really sorry, but I'm actually not inviting any coworkers," because it was really awkward. I had a lot of people coming up like, "Can I come to the wedding?" It's like, "You don't even work with me. Like, I barely know you. No, you can't come to the wedding." So I get a lot of people asking if they could come to the wedding. And I'd be like, "No, I'm sorry. I'm not inviting any coworkers." A very easy out. This deeply offended Joe. Joe, I will never know why. And in fact, it was a running joke amongst my coworkers, like, Joe just wants to go to your wedding so that he can object, right? It was a running joke. It's not a joke I participated in. I was not a fan of Joe's, I don't want to say affection, I guess attention. I was not a fan. It never seemed to go too far, although in hindsight, that whole Google Earth thing really isn't great. Still, I wasn't a fan. And so I kept saying no, and Joe was genuinely offended. Well, at the last minute, we had several members of our family who couldn't make it, and I finally go to Joe and I have an invitation. And the invitation is for him, his wife, and his son. I didn't feel right just inviting him. I felt like his family should come. And so I hand it to him, and he's very excited. And I'm like, "Okay, so I look forward to seeing you guys." And he's like, "Well, it'll probably just be me." And I'm like, "What? Why?" And he's like, "Oh, I just think my wife will be busy that weekend." I'm like, "Do you even know what weekend it is?" And he's like, "Oh, well, And so he's like, "You know what? Yeah, my wife will be taking my son. There's a special needs museum. It's like a sensory museum. And it comes once a month." And it did, to his credit, it was on that weekend. But I just remember thinking it was really weird that before he even knew the date, he was like, "No, my wife will not be there." The strange thing is he did come to the wedding. He did not object despite all the jokes. He did not object, but he only came for the ceremony. I made eye contact with him, and then he immediately left, which is really weird because our venue was quite far and in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it wasn't that in the middle of nowhere, but like, it was just a strange thing. But I don't know. I'm very much that person that if I go to a wedding, I'm going to eat some cake. So maybe that's just me. Regardless, you might be like, "Maybe who cares?" This will be important later. At least semi-important later. So at this point, things weren't bad with Joe. And in fact, I would call Joe like not a friend, but like one of those coworkers you're fine with, you're cool with. Joe seemed decent, albeit a little creepy. Joe was whatever. Joe was Joe. So during all of this time, I slowly kind of started rising through the ranks. I was hired as just the basic baseline person. I eventually was promoted to the same position that Joe was in, but I was on night shift at the time. And then eventually I was promoted to supervisor. Joe was not interested in moving up because at that job there was a lot of stress and responsibilities with moving up. Joe was perfectly happy to stay on that second rung. But when I became supervisor, I actually became Joe's supervisor eventually and started working with him a lot more often. There was this weird dynamic of Matey used to be under me, no pun intended at all, no joke intended, no giggity, get it out of here, gross. Matey used to be an underling, then we were equals, and now she is my supervisor. In addition, the age difference of being someone who's in your early 20s and essentially being a supervisor to people who were older than you was weird, not just with Joe, but with a lot of people in general. However, it was especially weird with Joe. We didn't necessarily butt heads. It's not like Joe was like, I don't respect you or like you. It was never like that, but Joe would laugh me off a lot whenever I would tell him like, hey, we need to go ahead and do this, or hey, this needs to be done. Joe would like just ignore me and disregard me. It happened enough times that it really started to bother me because there were several situations where it was like, hey, Joe, I was right on this and you really should have listened to me. And so I made a decision that I don't think I will ever forget. I went to both my boss and Joe's boss, who was over both of us, and I was like, look, I don't want Joe to get in trouble or anything. It's not like that. But here are these situations where I feel like Joe should have listened and Joe just kind of blatantly disregarded me and laughed me off and wouldn't listen to me. And I have done all I can think to do. Every time I try to have a serious talk with him, he just kind of laughs me off. He ignores me. I don't know what else to do. And my boss agreed like, yeah, no, that is unacceptable. We cannot have that. Let's call Joe in here. Now, I cannot express enough that I said several times to my boss, privately and with Joe in there, hey, Joe, I'm not trying to get you in trouble, but we need to get on the same page. So the meeting, I remember, kind of went around and around in circles, and it was extremely frustrating and extremely annoying, where basically she would bring up these situations and Joe's like, oh, so I can never do this. And she's like, no, you can do this when the occasion calls for it, but your boss, aka Matey, was specifically telling you not to, and you were ignoring her. And he was furious. And in fact, both me and my boss were like, why are you upset? You're not in trouble. We just want to all get on the same page. Joe wasn't even in the same book. And so we leave. And the office situation was where our boss's office was literally connected to the main office. So her door was always open. She could always hear the comings and goings. And I could feel the heat coming off of Joe from his cubicle. Worth noting, we also had like glass walls between our cubicles. You could see everybody. They could see you. And I could just feel Joe's rage. And his cubicle was next to mine. So Joe says nothing and my boss leaves. And Joe turns and looks at me with such hate and venom and says, I can't believe that you did this. I can't believe you would do this to me. And I'm like, what are you talking about? What are you saying? Joe just kept repeating, I can't believe you did this to me. I can't believe you did this to me. I'm like, nothing's happening, Joe. You're not in trouble. I specifically said I didn't want you to be in trouble. I just want you to listen to me whenever I tell you to do something, because I am ultimately your boss. And Joe was like, I have so many coworkers, I have so many bosses, and I thought I had a friend in you, and I don't. Our relationship is not what I thought it was. And I'm like, I am ultimately your boss. I'm like, we can be cool and that's totally fine, but I am ultimately your boss, and I went to our boss because you wouldn't listen to me. And then Joe says to me, that's okay. Lots of people have come and gone through here. Lots of my bosses, nobody ever sticks around. I've been here the longest, and I will be here long after you're gone. If I have to wait you out, I will. And one day, you won't be here, and I will. And when I say, I think I physically felt my blood pressure rise when that man said that to me. I felt it rise, and right then, my boss walked in. And you ever been so mad that you're in tears? I wasn't quite crying, but like the eyes were glassy, and she immediately sensed it. And she was like, what's going on? What's happening? And Joe's like, nothing. And I just like, I went to speak and it was like I was sputtering. And so I left. I walked out. I went and took a walk and went and sat away from Joe. And so my boss asked Joe, what happened? What did you say? And Joe was like, I just said that this would be a lot for us to work through, and like just all bullshit. And I just really thought that we had a different dynamic than she was saying that we did in that meeting. So my boss came and found me and was like, no, that is unacceptable that Joe said that to you. That is wrong. I am sending Joe home for the day. And so she gave Joe a talking to. Joe got sent home for the day. And so we both had some days off in between seeing each other. And so I thought certainly when I returned back to work, things would be better. Narrator, things would not be better. Things were not better for good old Joe and I. We got in, and again, like clear glass cubicles. And so I can basically see the steam coming out of his ears. If anything, he seemed just as angry as he did the day of that meeting. It was an awkward few days. Like, even if I had to address Joe with like work stuff, Joe would just shoot me these glares, these daggers. And several of my coworkers ended up going to my boss and saying, hey, I don't know what's going on with Joe and Matey, but like he has been being really like shooting her dirty looks and like being kind of disrespectful and like not listening to her, basically. Not in the sense like I'd basically be like, here, do you have, your paperwork for the end of the day? And like he would ignore me and stuff like that. But I was deeply uncomfortable and I didn't really want to say anything. I just was like, maybe Joe needs some time to cool off. Well, my coworkers were like, nah. So they went, and my boss basically told Joe, like, okay, you're suspended. You cannot do that. She is your boss. We sent you home for the day for you to like think about what all you did, and you did not do that. So you're suspended. Get out of here. So Joe got suspended for a few days, came back, the exact same attitude. And so my boss was paying very close attention when Joe returned. And my boss basically called him into the office with me and another manager and was like, Joe, there's clearly something we're not understanding here. You need to explain yourself. Joe was like in tears, and it wasn't the most uncomfortable, because we'll get there, but it was very uncomfortable. And Joe kept saying like, I thought it was different with me and Matey. I thought that we had a different relationship. I thought that we were truly close beyond just coworkers. And, so both managers kind of explained to him what I've been saying this whole time. Like, yeah, even if you guys were friends, like she's still your boss, and it's still, your behavior is not acceptable. And Joe promised like, okay, I'm going to turn over a new leaf. Clearly things weren't what I thought they would be, and I will be better from here on out. I will. Cool. So Joe avoided suspension and went back to his desk, and the managers both were like, is something going on with you two? And I was like, hell no, something's not going on between us. Because keep in mind, at this point, I was married. I was a newlywed, but also no.
Brother, what's that? What's that, brother?
The other manager, who didn't know us very well, insisted something was going on, something was weird, yada, yada. And I mean, something was weird, but it wasn't me. Not this time, anyway. That evening, my boss goes home for the day, and we worked past 5. And so Joe turns to me, and it's with a whole different vibe. And Joe says, I have something for you. You gave it to me a while back ago, and I don't know why you did that, so I want to give it back. And Joe goes into his backpack, and he reaches in there, and he pulls out the wedding invitation that I had given him 5 months ago. Actually, 6. It was 6 months ago. Pulls out this wedding invitation and is like, you gave this to me, and I don't know why you gave it to me, and I don't want it anymore. I don't want it anymore. And all I can think to myself, truly in that moment, I was so like flabbergasted. And maybe I was like, even now, maybe I'm like overthinking this. But all I could think was, have you been carrying this around for 6 months? That was the first thing I thought. And then the second thing I thought was, what if he had it at home and put it in his bag last night so he could pull it out and have this like soap opera level moment with me? So I tell Joe, I'm like, Joe, I don't need that. If you don't want to have it, that's okay. You can throw it away. And Joe insists, I'm not throwing it away. You need to take it. And I was like, I'm just going to put it in your cubby and you can throw it away. And it lived in Joe's cubby for the rest of his time. all the live long day. It was weird. So you might be like, matey, other than the Google Earth thing, none of this is stalker behavior. So like, what are you talking about? Well, this is probably the worst time that I had with Joe, the months that followed this. Basically, anytime I was ever around Joe, it was deeply uncomfortable. I always thought like maybe things would shift and change, and they never did. They never did. It just was always uncomfortable. And then I don't know what happened, but one day Joe comes to work and says, there were a lot of people at your house this weekend. What's up with that? And I'm like, what are you talking about, Joe? And he's like, there were a lot of people. Now, it's worth noting that my significant other's niece had a birthday, and there were a lot of people at the house. And so I'm like, why were you driving past my house in Smallville, which is 45 minutes away from here? And Joe got very defensive and was like, well, can I like drive through my old neighborhood? What, just because you live there, I can't drive through there anymore? And I was like, I guess not. It's just really weird that you're coming up to me asking me why so many people are at my house. Like, first of all, that's none of your business. And second of all, like, what the hell? So Joe was irritated, whatever, fine. But then it kept happening. Joe would come by and be like, hey, so saw you cut your grass this weekend. Looks good. Lawn's looking good. Hey, why was your car parked out in the lawn? Hey, your car wasn't in all weekend. Multiple situations of Joe saying that. And now and then, half the time, it got to the point where I would ignore him. It is worth noting that through all this, his cubicle ended up getting moved. And so he wasn't right next to me at all times like he used to be. But he would always come by to comment on something relating to my house. And I would call him out. I mean, at first I'd call him out every time. Why are you driving past my house? And he'd either give that, like, why can't I drive in my own neighborhood? Like, I used to have a house there. My childhood home was there. Worth noting, he did not have family there anymore. His mother had passed, and that was her house. It was sold. He did not have family there. I cannot stress that enough. It would at least be a little better if he had family there. Still creepy, but a little better. He did not have family there. You know, his excuses varied, though. Sometimes it would be, I can't drive through my old neighborhood. Sometimes it'd be, oh, I wanted to go to the discount store that's in that town. And yeah, it was weird. It was uncomfortable, but nothing ever felt substantial to me in my 20-year-old brain to be like, oh my God, I need to do something about this. I would update my boss semi-regularly on various things, but just nothing seemed important. It wasn't as bad as when he was being straight up adversarial. Another thing worth noting is that at the time, for a while there, especially when Joe's cubicle got moved away from me, Joe barely said 2 words to me. It was a very uncomfortable air, but I preferred it that way. I definitely preferred it to adversarial and all that. But intermixed with that would be what I have dubbed the I forgive you speeches. He gave me probably about 3 or 4 of these. He was always very teary. It was very like, I don't want to say heartfelt because I feel like that gives it something that it does not have, but he would come up to me. The most memorable one was he came up to me and he's like, I've had something weighing on my mind and I want to talk to you about it. And I'm like, okay. He basically said to me, I can't keep being as angry with you as I have been. I need to let this go. Now, it's worth noting again, this was like 4 or 5 months after all of that stuff happened with him getting suspended and all that stuff. And so he's like, I will go for my run and I just see your face and it hurts. It hurts to think about you and it hurts to think about what happened and everything. And I have to forgive you. I want to forgive you. And again, just immensely uncomfortable. I would always just be like, well, thank you. I'm glad you feel better about the situation. Like as neutral as I could. It was very uncomfortable. And so he did that a few times, the I forgive you speeches, and I wanted to like throw myself in a lake. So the story does kind of have an ending. He ended up transferring. Basically, I would report all of his stuff to my boss. Half of it was taken seriously, half of it was not. Actually, I would say most of it wasn't really taken seriously, unfortunately, other than him being very like aggressive. The creepy stuff, it wouldn't be taken seriously. And there was an HR department. And I really, in hindsight, I should have gone to HR. I don't know what I was thinking. He basically was on his last legs. Like if he got suspended again, like there was a chance he was going to get fired. And so after well over 10 years in the department, he transferred. He was still within, but he wasn't in my department. So during his last 2 weeks, he kept asking me, are you going to miss me? Will you miss me? And the first time he asked that, I was like, I miss the way things used to be, is how I answered it. And then after that, I would stop answering him. And so finally, one day, about 2 days before his last day, he asked me again when I was relieving him for lunch, because I did not interact with him any more than I had to. He asked me, are you going to miss me, matey? And I said to him, I was so irritated. And I was just like, you keep asking me this. I want you to stop asking me. Please stop. And he paused and he kind of looked off and he looked at me. And before I say what he said to me, I just want to give a trigger warning for, I guess, like threats of violence, threats of, I don't know what I can say without YouTube being like banned, gone forever. Just trigger warning for like some graphic things. So Joe says to me, again, are you going to miss me? And I'm like, Joe, I'm not going to answer that. Like, you need to stop. No lead in. Joe says, you know, matey, when you skin a body, you have to do it in a warm place or they'll freeze to death while you're skinning them. Now, I'm alone with Joe in the office at this point. And so there's a desk between us and I'm like, Joe, why are you saying this to me? And Joe's like, I just think it's interesting, don't you? And when you dump a body into the ocean, you have to puncture it a bunch of times so that it'll sink to the bottom. And again, I'm like, Joe, why are you saying this to me? I just think it's interesting. I think it's interesting. Joe went off to lunch, and that was actually probably the last time I talked to Joe. I did tell my boss. Basically, my boss's mindset at that point, though, was Joe's transferring, no harm done, no big deal. I felt like it was a big enough deal, but I was very nervous to go over my boss's head and go to HR. I kind of mentioned at the beginning of the video, like, yeah, the job security at this place and everything was really important to me. I didn't want to rock the boat. But in hindsight, I don't know, I kind of wish I had because, as much as everybody expressed to me like, wow, Joe's been working here for 10 years. I've been working here for 5 and I've never seen Joe act this way. Like it was like a special me thing. I don't believe that. It's not that I'm special. It just happened to be that I was the special thing in that moment. Regardless, there is something of an end to this story. I mentioned that Joe had a wife and she did technically work within our department. She was in a different department, but within the umbrella of our department. That doesn't make sense, but I hope you guys feel what I'm putting down. Joe's wife was his replacement when Joe transferred. So I went to my boss and I was like, hey, I'm really uncomfortable with this. Joe's wife probably hates me. Can't imagine what Joe's wife has heard about me. And my boss was like, yeah, I asked her about it in the interview. I said, listen, I understand Joe has had some problems with Matey. Is that Matey's going to be your new boss? Is that going to be a problem? And Joe's wife was like, had problems with Matey? What are you talking about? I don't recall Joe ever mentioning anything about Matey, good or bad. And I've always wondered, like, what the hell did Joe tell her when he got suspended and when he got sent home early that one day? What did Joe tell her? I will never know. And yeah, when I worked with Joe's wife, nothing ever came of it. No mentioning, no nothing. I never felt like bad vibes, like you husband stealing bitch. Not that I was interested in Joe, but like nothing ever happened. And finally, I did see Joe one more time. So this was actually last year. I always go back home for Thanksgiving to visit my family, and Henry always comes with me. And in the town that I don't live there anymore, obviously. I live in Missouri, but where Joe still lives, there's a set of trails, and they're pretty cool. There's some in the woods, and then there's a paved trail that kind of goes in the middle of all of this. And then at any point, well, not at any point, but at any point you can go down the paved trail or you can hop off and go through these wooded trails. And so the wooded trails are kind of snaky. They kind of go all over the place. And so me, Henry, and a friend of mine were in the wooded part of the trail. but now and then the trail would kind of run alongside of the paved trail. You feel me? No? Okay, it's okay. And so I was walking with them. We were all chit-chatting, and I hear a voice, and I immediately said out loud, "Oh my God, that sounds like Joe's son." And Henry knows who Joe is. Henry knows of the story and everything. Henry spins around and I spin around. And luckily there was a line of trees and sort of like an embankment. So it wasn't like a clear shot, but Joe was walking his dog and was out there with his son. Henry, you guys ever see that scene in Family Guy?
I just want to talk to him.
Why do you have a shotgun?
I just want to talk to him.
Dad, this is ridiculous.
I just want to talk to him. I just want to talk to him. I just want to talk to him. I just want to shoot him.
I had to physically hold Henry back. Henry was like, "I just want to talk to him. I just want to talk to him." And I'm like literally like physically holding him back. Like I never thought that this was a traumatic experience until I saw Joe again that day, and the feeling that settled in my chest of anxiety, just that heavy, like, oh my God, no, 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 no. I don't care. No. And so I physically held Henry back and begged him, like, do not go talk to him. Do not talk to him. Henry insists he just wanted to talk to him. I honestly think Henry wanted to fight. Henry swears that that's not the case. Henry's like, I'm not going to like knock him out in front of his special needs son. I'm not going to do that. I'm putting you on the spot.
For what?
So what would you have said that day when you saw him on the trail?
Ooh, I thought a little bit about this actually, once or twice.
Okay.
Well, mainly I would introduce myself and say, "Hey, I've heard so much about you. I'm Matey's husband, Henry. I've heard a lot about you."
Yeah, see, he would be overjoyed at that.
Yeah, but his wife wouldn't be.
His wife was not there.
You know what? I just want him to know that I'm contacting his wife. In fact, I'd probably just pull out the phone and just call his wife right there on the trail.
All right, we're done. So I guess that's the end of the story. I keep being like, oh, this story actually has an end. I guess it's not much of an end, but it's kind of an end. As far as I know, Joe still works at that same place in the other department. I'm okay. As far as I know, Joe doesn't know where I live. Joe also does not have social media, so nobody like goes snooping around for Joe. Joe, you ain't gonna find Joe, but he might find you. Okay, that's not funny, but some part of me is worried like he's gonna see this video. I don't know how, but he will regardless. Okay, that is the story. I hope you guys like that. I hope it wasn't too traumatic to listen to. I don't know why you would like, comment, and subscribe because this is not my usual shtick, but if you are interested in the growth of my channel, leave that like, leave that comment, subscribe. But other than that, I hope you have a great day. Okay, bye.